everyone to the Money Path. I am your host, Todd Schoenberger. Joining me today is Jackie Prideaux. She is a certified financial planner and partner at Brighton Jones. Jackie, welcome to the Money Path. I have to start. I want to ask about really, I would imagine a lot of your clients right now are building significant wealth a lot earlier in life than, say, past generations. Just
hmm
curious, but how does the psychological experience of first generational wealth shape the way you advise them?
Firstly, thanks for having me, Todd. Happy to be here. Yes, absolutely. We see a lot of first generation wealth. I serve as an advisor as Brighton Jones, as you mentioned, and I'm in Seattle, which happens to be seeing a very large uptick in first generation wealth in particular. A lot of tech firms here, entrepreneurs, people starting businesses. And I would say it's really interesting to watch the psychological impacts of rapid wealth creation without sort of the long-term frameworks that you might see with, say, a second or third generation wealth situation. In other words, we see a lot of clients, have a big liquidity event or they have a big stock concentration and they suddenly have a balance sheet that's much larger than previously, and they haven't necessarily taken really thoughtful steps yet, like say, someone with inherited wealth might take, for example.
So what are the financial, well, really, what are the emotional challenges that you've seen with someone who is accumulating that kind of wealth?
Good question. We see in our practice a lot of hesitation to make the right choice. So, the people with first generation wealth tend to be very smart, they're very hardworking, but they tend to question all of those financial moves. So often as an advisor, we're trying to make sure they feel empowered to make good financial decisions and not just be in, say, rapid accumulation mode, for example. We also see this scarcity mindset persist, even though they might come into a lot of good fortune and wealth. So I have clients, for example, who could retire in their 30s or 40s and they don't feel like it's enough, or they don't feel like that makes good sense because they feel like the more traditional model of working, to a more an older retirement age might make sense. So that scarcity mindset tends to really persist regardless of the speed at which they might create their wealth.
Okay. So what about the next gen then, where you have someone who is their passion project, they founded a tech company, for example, they accumulated wealth, but then they need to pass that through to the next generation. Are you finding that to be a seamless transition, or does I know Brighton Jones works soup to nuts on this,
hmm
but is it more seamless, or do you think there or do you see a little bit more friction from that next gen?
It's interesting to think about that because we see a lot of clients who, especially in younger generations, they want to make really good stewardship-based decisions for their kids. And it seems like to me, as an advisor and what I've witnessed, they're putting a lot more intentionality behind teeing their kids up. For example, I get many more clients these days asking about financial literacy for their kids than say my generation did. And so they're coming at it very thoughtfully in terms of how to tee up that next generation. But we still tend to see in our line of work that there's some hesitation or some stories that clients tell around what may or may not be appropriate. So, for example, they might say, "Well, I put all of the legal documents in place. I did, I checked the box with the estate attorney. I have all my beneficiaries updated, but I don't know that I'm comfortable yet talking to my kids about that topic." Or really, opening the can of worms and showing them my balance sheet. And that can present problems down the road, as you can probably imagine, if a child or a sibling is inheriting a company or a balance sheet without really understanding the ins and outs of that. And so we're oftentimes encouraging our clients little by little, gradually to loop in their kids. I have clients who are now bringing their kids to meetings so that they can hear, their advisory team talk to them about the balance sheet and what's going on with various assets. So it's sort of this push and pull, the desire to give that next generation more financial literacy, but the emotional sort of baggage or hesitation that comes along with letting go or showing too much information too quickly. So as advisors, we try to balance that as thoughtfully as we can.
Just curious, at what age do you see? I mean, where you have someone who is first generation, they bring their kid. I mean, how old are these kids when they're hearing and they're a part of these meetings?
Um, I have lots of clients who bring their 20 somethings to meetings. Oftentimes, our clients are reaching out to us to say have conversations with their kids early, but it's more of a setting good habits and providing some frameworks for, say, the high school generation or college age kids, where I see parents tend to actually bring the kids into meetings is when those kids are usually a little bit more launched, they have a little bit more capacity to understand, or they can relate. They have a job, right? And they're saving and they might want to understand more about their own financial situation and their own planning. And so the parents tend to gradually pull them in over time.
Right, right. And you had experience with the Peace Corps. Thank you for your
Mhm.
service. And I
Thank
would
you.
imagine you saw friction, you saw hostile moments. So I'd imagine within a family, you probably have a few of those as well. I'm just curious, who drives the bus though on that one? Is that a you as the advisor? Then you are instructing your client saying, "Look, I think you got to bring in little Billy now on this," or is it that your client, I guess, who's driving it?
I would say it's a partnership. I have
Okay.
clients who, for example, I have a client who has young kids, but they know that their family business, the kids don't have interest in inheriting that business and taking over. And so part of our gentle encouragement is, instead of having, God forbid, a situation where those kids are now left to figure out how to put the pieces together if mom and dad are no longer around, bringing those kids into the conversation so that they know what their parents' intents and wishes are if they don't want to, take the baton from mom and dad, or situations where kids might really be feeling like they are in the dark or they're witnessing some family tension and they don't quite know how to put their finger on that. I'm gently encouraging clients to have more open conversations, but it all starts with meeting that client where they're at and getting to know them first because they might have values that align with their balance sheet and maybe their kids share different values. And so we want to make sure we're treading thoughtfully, if that makes sense.
It does make sense. And I am curious on the value part of this is
Hmm.
that now you have this first generation, they have values and maybe they're thinking, okay, X amount of percent goes to philanthropy, whatever it is, and
Hmm.
how they live their lives. I mean, can you give us an example? I would imagine there's some drama when it comes to some of these. I'm thinking of the show Succession, of course.
Yeah.
But when I think of a next gen who's thinking, I don't want any of that. I don't need that. I mean, how do you manage that if you have, say, three kids, two are in on board with this thing, but the third is not, but they're still part of the entire estate?
Good question. I fortunately don't have real life succession going on with any of our clients. That would be a whole different podcast, probably.
I'm sure.
But I do witness situations where different kids of the same family or even different siblings have different stations in life, different desires. We have clients who are changing their estate documents over time, for example, or the way a business is structured over time, because one child may say, I really wasn't interested in the financial path or getting more ingrained in this, mom and dad, but now I am. Or, I really don't, for example, I don't want the family home. I don't want to manage that. I don't want to inherit that. And so parents are often sitting down with their kids and figuring out, okay, if only two out of the three of you want a certain asset or a business, then how are we going to structure this? And who best to loop in maybe even an independent third party that's, perhaps the Brighton Jones team is involved, but someone to help steward that and shepherd those kinds of conversations because as you can probably imagine, family conversations around finances can get pretty dicey. So again, meeting clients where they're at and figuring out what they want for each of their kids and how best to structure the planning around that.
Okay. I'd imagine, yeah, everybody has a tailored custom plan on all these, and I can completely respect that. Let's turn the page to women.
Okay.
So Brighton Jones Women Wealth Initiative, I know is a big part. You talk about values for a firm. I know that's huge for Brighton Jones. What gaps have you seen though in wealth management for women?
hmm hmm Several over the years. I would say the biggest ones that come to mind are the fact that women, just by sheer nature of our DNA, tend to live longer. And so they're often stewarding and managing wealth after their spouses have passed, for example. They're also more likely to get divorced or widowed and find themselves with all of a sudden managing a financial situation that they potentially weren't before. They also tend to take time off for having kids. It's just sort of a known reality of the way things are structured sometimes. And so we find that those large life events are happening in tandem with a tendency towards women not necessarily being as engaged, financially fluent as their male counterparts. Not always. It does seem to be trending more towards equality in that case, but when we as advisors sit down at the table with our clients, if it's, a male and female spouses, for example, we try very hard to meet that couple where they're at and make sure that the female voice is heard, that we're listening to both, that we're trying to prepare for, God forbid, those situations where, the woman in the room might be making the decisions by herself.
Right. And do you have a do you do you advise on when you're meeting with a couple that you have an individual time, some individual time with the woman? And if that's the case, if that it does happen, how does the man take that advice?
I would say we don't necessarily try to carve out time so distinctly as you just outlined. I think it's more about ensuring that we're presenting or speaking or even the type of communication is done in a way that meets them both where they're at. So, for example, I have couples and it could be the man or the woman who might say, oh, I don't pay attention to cash flow, or I don't know what bills we pay, or that's in my partner's court. And instead of just not sharing things with that spouse, we might say, okay, what's a more helpful way that you might then be involved in the plan that we're trying to carve out? And meeting them where they're at, or maybe you have a female who's very philanthropically inclined and a partner who is but doesn't care so much about the dynamics, and maybe that's where she would really shine and really want to voice her opinions and her desires around the family philanthropic goals. But I think a lot of it is making sure that whether or not they're both in the room, that we're tailoring the content in a way that if one of them is not around, they know they can call us and they have, an understanding of what's going on in their financial life. That's really the ultimate goal, I would say.
So with couples though, do men ask you to help the female spouse and educate them, or because I would imagine from a
hmm
well, I guess it's a two-part question. I mean, I noticed in my own family with the older generations, so with my parents, what has happened, and then I see it on the younger side. And I mean, I guess I guess let me frame the question this way,
hmm
Jackie. So, do you find it that with a younger generation with men, are they trying to get their female spouse more educated when it comes to finances?
Yes, I would say
Okay.
with as a trend, the younger generation is more intentional about that. And to answer your early question around how we approach it when that's an explicit need,
Mm-hmm.
I would say we oftentimes are saying to our female clients, let's just carve out time separately and just go through whatever that was just on the agenda that you want to spend more time on. Whether that's something just because she wants to understand it more or because she's more interested. So we're trying to empower our female clients by saying, let us take all the time you need. Let us carve out a separate meeting. And again, to your question around watching male counterparts bring their partners along, we do see that more often with younger generations. And oftentimes younger females have been brought up in an environment where they have just more financial literacy than say older generations in general. And so they're starting on a similar playing field than say generations of the past because they have financial courses at school or their family vernacular about financial literacy at home might be a little bit more open. So it's a both and, I would say.
I understand. What about for older generations when the male spouse passes? Is it too late to go through the education process, the financial literacy process for an older widow?
Here's what I would say. I wouldn't say it's too late necessarily to educate, but I would say that we are oftentimes trying very hard to focus on very specific, very, it's an emotionally charged time when someone loses a spouse. When I have clients who lose a long-term spouse, oftentimes the tiny things that they're concerned about might not be what I as an advisor think about in my day-to-day. They just want to know, is my checking account, is there a balance in that account that's going to be big enough to pay these XYZ bills? And maybe they don't have capacity to go into a whole conversation about portfolio rebalancing, for example, or all the mechanics of updated estate documents. So oftentimes it's not that we're not trying to educate them or empower them, but it's focusing slowly and thoughtfully on what might feel really important to them in the moment. And then over time, gently encouraging them to do, for example, a new will or have, their tax situation might change. And that might be a little bit too much to think about and process right off the bat. But we try to keep that back of mind and as a priority for later.
Right, right. I'm shocked. I personally, my father passed years ago, and how little my mother knows. I mean, I just can't. I'm just stunned by this and a little bit in disbelief. But maybe it's just maybe she was just didn't want to learn. I don't know, but that's a whole other story for another
Right.
time.
I'm
Off
sorry to hear
camera.
that.
So yeah, one final question for you. So, what's one piece of advice that you would give to someone who is looking for legacy planning, as far as going through the estate process and really thinking of values and passing on that wealth? What is that one key piece that you would tell them?
That's a great question. It's hard as a planner to have one one piece of advice. My brain goes a million different
I
directions.
knew I would stump you eventually.
I would say having someone, a client, be able to articulate what they value and having those values align with the planning that they're putting in place. I think a lot of that legacy planning comes down to that because you can get a will completed and have a tax strategy, but if it's not in alignment with what that person really values deep down, then what's the point? And
Right.
so I think oftentimes we are focusing on the mechanics, the logistics, because that's just what an advisor needs to do to orchestrate all of those moving pieces. But if we are not aware of what that person really values deep down, I want to be able to say to a client, hey, I feel like these pieces aren't quite in alignment with what you've shared with me, right? Instead of maybe doing the decision or making the decision that is the best math financial based decision, I can say, hey, I know you well enough to know that it feels like this is, the right path for you to choose, even if it might not be the most financially lucrative one. So In a
Yeah.
nutshell, that feels to me as an advisor that's the beautiful part about financial planning, that balance of the math and the human.
Yeah, no, that's a brilliant answer, and that's what I love about Brighton Jones. The idea that they're not just transactional based; they're actually going to incorporate the value of what the values of the family. I mean, with the person that's built that wealth, it's their passion project. But at the next, they're not. These are smart people. They know what's important at that next level. So completely understand. Jackie,
Exactly.
this was a fantastic conversation. Got to have you back again. I know this is an evolving conversation because there are so many other things that we can get further into, particularly when it comes to women's wealth. And but I do really appreciate you joining me today.
You're very welcome. Please have me back anytime. Thanks, Todd.
Absolutely. Absolutely. So, on behalf of Jackie Prideaux, I am Todd Schoenberger. Thank you once again for joining us on the Money Path. Coming up tomorrow, we have Miss Schneider on Financial Compass. You will not believe what she has to say about the gold trade. 12 o'clock noon Eastern Time tomorrow, live. You will want to hear what she has to say. Until then, take care.